Well, good morning and welcome to CBS News Mornings. It's almost 7 o'clock here in New York City. I'm Anne-Marie Green, and here's a look at the stories grabbing our attention right now. Search and rescue efforts have intensified in Louisiana after a powerful and deadly tornado left at least one person dead and thousands without power. We're going to tell you where that storm system is headed next and about the cleanup that is now underway. President Biden heads to Brussels as the Pentagon reports a reduction in the number of Russian troops in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine says that it has won back a key town outside of the capital. We're going to catch you up on all the breaking overnight developments there. And new details reveal most Americans say that the Senate should confirm Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. Ahead, we'll have all the highlights from her first day of questioning. Plus, we have an update on the Omicron subvariant. It's known as BA2, and insights into just how dominant the new COVID strain is becoming. And then kidnapped in her own car, we're going to have the latest on the search for a missing 18-year-old in Nevada who police say may have been abducted on her way to work.
This is life or death for a beautiful and fun and amazing sister, daughter, and friend. She was just starting. She is. She's just starting her adult life.
Well, we will share her family's desperate plea for the person responsible to bring her back home. But first, we are following that breaking news on a powerful tornado that ripped through the city of New Orleans and its suburbs overnight, killing at least one person. At least two twisters, including this one, tore through New Orleans and the surrounding area, causing damage to neighborhoods ravaged by Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. Heavy winds knocked down power lines, flipped cars, and leveled homes. Thousands are still without power this morning. And on to the war in Ukraine. President Biden is heading to Europe this morning for consequential meetings with NATO allies and Western leaders. And it comes nearly 1 month after Russia invaded Ukraine, triggering a global crisis. Bradley Blackburn has more.
President Biden leaves for Brussels this morning on his way to meet with NATO and European leaders to discuss the war in Ukraine.
He will have the opportunity to coordinate on the next phase of military assistance to Ukraine. He will join our partners in imposing further sanctions on Russia.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the president will announce joint actions to reduce Europe's dependence on Russian gas. Despite a continued Russian bombardment, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby says Ukrainian forces are now attempting to take back occupied territories.
We have seen indications that the Ukrainians are going a bit more on the offense now.
Ukraine's military says it recaptured the strategically important town of Makariv just outside the capital Kyiv, and they're now fighting to wrest back control of the cities of Izium and Kherson.
Але крок за кроком йдемо вперед.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says step by step peace negotiations are moving forward, though in an interview with CNN, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov refused to rule out the possibility of nuclear attacks.
President Putin intends to make the world listen to and understand our concerns.
Moscow is cracking down on dissidents at home. Yesterday, Russia's most prominent opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, was sentenced to 9 years in prison.
All right, so for more on this, we want to take you to the western city of Lviv. That is where foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tayeb has been reporting for us. So, Imtiaz, a lot of developments now overnight. But let's talk about President Biden. What's President Biden's goal on this trip?
Anne-Marie, in short, unity. He wants this show of unity when he arrives in Brussels, where he's going to have multiple meetings. He'll be meeting with NATO, he'll be meeting with the Group of Seven, and he'll be meeting with the European Union. And he will then come to this region, to next door neighboring Poland, where he'll be meeting with folks there as well. But again, it really is this theme of unity that President Biden really wants to project not only to the world and to Ukraine, but to President Putin. He wants President Putin to know that NATO, its allies, and indeed countries around the world are standing up against his offensive here in Ukraine. Now, we also understand that President Biden will also be discussing with European leaders what's been described as red lines. What are these red lines? Well, that essentially means what could potentially happen, or what could Vladimir Putin and his forces potentially do that could draw NATO into this fight. Those red lines include some kind of nuclear assault, some sort of chemical warfare, and as far as some sort of cyber attack. Of course, nobody wants any of those things to happen, certainly not anything nuclear or chemical, but that is a discussion that's going to be had if NATO needs to go from a defensive posture into an offensive posture. Because remember, any kind of assault on NATO as part of this 30-nation alliance, which includes the US, according to their doctrine, means an assault on them is an assault on every single one of those nations. So this has the potential of being a very serious conflict. Again, everybody wants to avoid that, but they are preparing for the worst, and President Biden very clearly wants to lead the way on that. Anne-Marie.
Battle goes in Ukraine. The Pentagon is saying that Russian forces are shrinking, and Ukrainian forces say that they've managed to retake a city just outside of Kyiv. Can you give us any more insight?
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I mean, going back to the very beginning of this conflict, it was very clear that Russia thought that they would sort of lead this lightning strike. They'd take Kyiv in 2 days and really it'd be job done. And now here we are, nearly a month into fighting, and it's very much the opposite of that. The resistance that we've seen Ukrainian forces put up against this far superior fighting force which has far superior weapons, way more soldiers, and yet they're really struggling. And as you rightly say, we've seen these Ukrainian fighters themselves go from defensive to offensive and trying to retake some of this territory that they've lost. And it really just goes to show that the Russian military, in whatever planning it did leading up to this war, was not anticipating the kind of resistance that they're facing from Ukrainian forces. Ukrainian forces, a lot of whom are essentially regular folks who put on uniforms, picked up a weapon, and started fighting to defend their towns, to defend their cities, to defend their communities. In saying all of that, we have to remember that Russia, although at this very specific moment in the conflict may not be doing as well as it probably wants to, or that many of us expected, we just have to look at the horrors that it's inflicting in Mariupol, that it's been able to inflict on Kharkiv and indeed in and around Kyiv, and that if at some point this Russian military is able to recalibrate and fix whatever's going wrong, the kind of offensive that it's able to wage, the kind of war that it's able to fight, is pretty scary when you think about it. But in saying all of that, that resistance, that Ukrainian resistance, has been pretty extraordinary and inspiring to see. Anne-Marie.
So true, MTS. Very remarkable. MTS Tayyab, thank you very much. Well, the White House says that Russia could unleash devastating cyber attacks against U.S. companies and infrastructure. Major Garrett has more on the Kremlin's potential targets and how NATO could respond.
FBI Director Christopher Wray said Russia appears to be preparing to launch cyber attacks in the U.S.
Most cyber attacks don't just happen in an instant. There's activity that leads up to it. There's scanning and researching of victims, scanning for vulnerabilities in systems. So there's a whole range of preparatory work, which is what we've been seeing.
A March 18th FBI bulletin obtained by CBS warned at least 23 U.S. companies that 140 Russian-linked IP addresses were scanning networks for vulnerabilities for use in potential future intrusions. The bulletin noted the tempo has increased since Russia invaded Ukraine and that 5 U.S. energy companies appear to be the hackers' current focus.
The magnitude of Russia's cyber capacity is fairly consequential, and it's coming.
Russia has twice used cyber attacks to disrupt Ukraine's power grid, and as President Biden prepares for a NATO conference on Ukraine, the alliance must decide if a Russian cyber attack on a NATO member would trigger a unified response.
We could see circumstances in which a collective response by the alliance to a cyber attack would be called by an ally. That is absolutely something where we and other countries could bring capabilities to bear to help a country both defend itself and respond to a particular cyber attack.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said NATO wouldn't necessarily respond militarily to a full-blown cyber attack.
That response could take many different forms.
You know, we are effectively in a wartime situation, and everybody needs to be a part of the team here.
Chris Krebs led federal cybersecurity efforts during the Trump administration.
The game plan here for the Kremlin is not necessarily actually a technical attack that really disrupts infrastructure. They're trying to get into our heads. They want to distract us. They want to create fear and panic here.
Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will face another round of questioning from senators today. And this comes after answering questions for more than 12 hours yesterday. Lawmakers pressed her on everything from her judicial philosophy to her record dealing with criminal defendants. Jen Crawford has the highlights.
My judicial philosophy is to rule impartially and to rule consistent with the limitations on my authority as a judge.
So you wouldn't say that you're an activist judge?
I would not say that.
On the first day of questioning, senators focused on how Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson would rule as a justice.
What do you say to people who say you're soft on crime or even anti-law enforcement?
As someone who has had family members on patrol and in the line of fire, I care deeply about public safety.
Democratic Judiciary Committee Chair Dick Durbin opened the day with questions from the Republican playbook, giving Jackson a chance to preempt expected lines of attack, including allegations as a judge she was lenient in sentencing child pornography offenders.
As a mother and a judge who has had to deal with these cases, I was thinking that nothing could be further from the truth.
That was a preview of one of the day's testier exchanges with Senator Ted Cruz, a Harvard Law School classmate.
Do you believe the voice of the children is heard?
Yes, Senator, I do.
Could you explain how?
Your chart does not include all of the factors that Congress has told judges to consider.
Two major law enforcement organizations have endorsed Jackson, and even some opponents have called similar attacks baseless.
In every case, I did my duty to hold the defendants accountable in light of the evidence and the information that was presented to me.
Republicans also focused on her representation of detainees at Guantanamo and whether she would consider race in her decisions. Democrats answered back to defend her and asked Jackson why her historic nomination matters.
One of the things that having diverse members of the court does is it provides for the opportunity for role models.
So here to discuss is CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe. Rebecca, thanks for joining us. This is the first time that we've seen Judge Jackson actually defend herself to Republican lawmakers. How do you think she's doing so far?
I think she's doing great. She's remained calm the entire time, mostly answering questions, doing her best to refocus the questioning on her qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice and away from sort of hot button political questions that are being used really as a teaser for the election rather than pertaining to her particular abilities as a Supreme Court justice. So, I think she's done a good job. The questioning has been hard, but, this is the way these confirmation hearings have been going these past few decades.
So the criticism focuses on sort of two areas, crime and punishment, and then her defense of Guantanamo detainees. I want to ask you about how they approached her record on crime and how you think she responded.
So, there are a couple of things here. The first is she does have a past as a federal defender, a public federal defender, and as such, she has been a criminal defense attorney. So the effort is to link her with her clients, to in some way suggest that she's sympathetic with criminals because she served in her role. And I think she's done a good job of deflecting that criticism. Representing criminal defendants does not necessarily mean that one is, in fact, it doesn't mean at all that one is sympathetic with those criminals, what they have done. Instead, it is, as she has said over and over again, an important role in American government and in the American constitutional order, because it is one of the key ways that we ensure that the government itself is abiding by the laws, and it's a way of protecting the civil liberties of the innocent. So it's a hard concept, I think, to get, and I think that the Republicans have done a pretty good job of suggesting that, the combination between her past practice and some of her judicial opinions mean that she is in some way aligned with the far left and, the defund the police movement. And, I think if you dig down, those are pretty unfair allegations when it comes to Judge Jackson, and it remains to be seen. I don't think it will be particularly convincing in terms of the public's sense of her qualifications for this job, but it is a preview of how the Republican Party is trying to frame the upcoming elections.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there, that a reminder that, these senators are not necessarily talking to her, they're talking to their constituents, right? They're thinking about, their next run for office, and that's part of the reason why we see this repeated line of questioning, even though she's, responding to the same questions over and over again, which brings me to something else that she was asked about by Lindsey Graham, her defense of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. I want to play a little of the exchange there.
Did you support the idea that indefinite detention of an enemy combatant is unlawful?
Respectfully, Senator, when you are an attorney and you have clients who come to you, whether they pay or not, you represent their positions before the court.
So really quickly, what did we learn about this, and why is it significant?
So, one of the things is that it's a little bit complicated because, she has served in the past as a federal public defender where you have no choice of client. You're assigned your client, and it's a criminal case in which you have an obligation to represent that client zealously and do everything to poke holes in the government's case. The case that Senator Graham was discussing was a case in which she represented in private practice a number of clients, including the Cato Institute, in briefs to the Supreme Court. And so I think his line of questioning is a little bit more fair. Why did you choose to represent those clients? And are your views aligned with those clients? Because in that case, there was a choice, right? I mean, you obviously, once you're representing a client, you have to do so as diligently as possible. But why did she choose to do that? I think that's fair. But I think her answer is also fair, which is, look, we live in the legal system. And in this legal system, every single client deserves a representation, and a good representation, and especially in these sorts of cases where we're challenging the government. And she refused to engage with the underlying question of, whether she, the words in that brief are her own or were her clients. She said, I was acting as a lawyer, so I was representing those clients in their position before the Supreme Court. And there were some strong words in those briefs, as Senator Graham suggested, saying that the government was essentially engaged in war crimes. Was she actually alleging that former President Bush and Donald Rumsfeld were war criminals? And she backed off from that. And I think that's, that exchange, I think, was a little bit more legitimate than some of the other ones.
All right, Rebecca Roife, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's Supreme Court nomination continue today in Washington. Our coverage begins this morning at 9 Eastern, and you can stream the hearing uninterrupted on cbsnews.com/hearing. President Biden heads to Brussels in just a couple of hours for high-stakes NATO talks as Russia escalates its offensive across Ukraine. We're going to have a preview of what to expect coming up later on this hour. And a deadly tornado ravaged the South, killing at least one person in New Orleans. Jim Cantori from the Weather Channel will have a full forecast coming up next.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Some Republicans are now accusing companies like Twitter and Facebook of targeting conservatives.
They've had unchecked power to censor.
I do not have access to my main Facebook account.
I wasn't given an explanation. I was just like, what did I do?
It's not okay to shut down my voice simply because it's not the same as yours.
How those rules are enforced is something that the rest of us know very, very little about.
The First Amendment protects all of us from the government limiting our speech. The companies have the ability to decide what speech they will allow. They're not the government.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
Oh my God, the truck is sinking.
Devastating flooding has reached catastrophic levels.
Rising sea levels are threatening America's coasts.
You would have to take that house and put it on stilts 10 feet tall. If the street is filled with salt water, what difference does it make how high you make your house?
The highest rental rates is exactly where the elevation is highest.
This was the evidence to prove that climate gentrification was real.
Pay $1,800 in 5 days or you have to leave. Were you scared?
Yes.
Every single person who stood up and said, I am not paying this rent increase, received an eviction.
Haitians built this place and you're getting kicked out.
Yes.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
The COVID economic shutdown hit Las Vegas harder than any other major city in the nation.
It's decimated the entertainment community.
So even though it looks fairly busy, this is really just a fraction of what business was like prior to COVID.
Last week, there was another large hotel chain that 18,000 were let go.
I haven't seen any jobs that are even close to what I was making.
We're trying to keep things as normal for our kids. I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son.
And I see every day people losing their homes, having to leave Las Vegas.
If I have to start over somewhere else, I have to start over.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
It's 8:22 p.m. in Tokyo, very busy there. It's also where Ukraine's President Zelensky spoke just moments ago to the Japanese parliament in a virtual address. Of course, he is calling on Tokyo to put more pressure on Russia. Meantime, it is 7:22 here in New York City. CBS News Mornings is back with a look at some of the stories that you may have missed while you were offline. Chinese state media reports search crews discovered a black box from the China Eastern Airlines flight that crashed on Monday. Black boxes record flight information, and investigators hope it can help them figure out just what happened. All 132 people who were on that plane are presumed dead. And the world's top women's tennis player, Ashley Barty, is retiring at the age of 25. Barty announced on social media that she is stepping away to chase other dreams. She won 3 Grand Slam singles, including the Australian Open in January. Utah's governor has vetoed a bill that would ban transgender kids from playing girls' sports. He joins Indiana's governor as the second GOP leader to block similar legislation this week. In all, 11 states have enacted measures to stop trans youth from participating in athletics. And as we mentioned earlier, Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will face more questions from lawmakers today during her confirmation hearings. Jackson forcefully defended her record as a federal judge and a public defender during yesterday's testimony. So Nicole Killian is on Capitol Hill with what we can expect today. Nicole, thanks for joining us. All right, so, what topics can we expect today for the judge to be questioned on, or can we expect more of the same?
I think it'll be more of the same. I mean, look, lawmakers will get today 20 minutes to question Judge Jackson, 20 minutes apiece compared to 30 minutes yesterday. So really, it'll probably be an opportunity for them to ask some of the questions they didn't get to ask yesterday, or to drill down further on some of the things that they raised. Obviously, we heard a lot yesterday on everything from the judge's judicial philosophy. A lot of members had questions, for instance, about her take on different cases. For instance, the issue of Roe and that being settled law. That issue came up, as well as some other hot button issues before the court. You also had a number of Republicans that pressed her on the issue of court packing. And then there were some, questions that some might say were on the fringe. We saw issues like critical race theory being brought up. We saw, Senator Hawley of Missouri bring up some of those questions about the judge's handling and her sentencing of child sex offenders, which he had previewed in advance of this hearing. Of course, Judge Jackson responded to that, basically refuting those claims and saying that she took a lot of factors into account when she invoked a lot of those sentences and really tried to push back against some of the senator's claims.
Yeah, speaking of critical race theory, that's one of the topics that Ted Cruz brought up, and you actually got a chance to catch up with him and ask him some questions. I want to play some of that sound.
How is that relevant to serving on the Supreme Court?
Because the Supreme Court has a responsibility to enforce the Constitution, to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Critical race theory, I think, is based on a false and revisionist narrative of this country.
All right, that was a good question, Nicole. Sort of based on your conversations with lawmakers, how do they think things are going? And what's the likelihood of her getting Republican votes? She got Republican votes before for previous positions where she had to go through a Senate hearing. Will she be able to retain those?
Yeah, I think that's a big question going forward. But obviously, I think for the most part, most senators feel that this continues to be a respectful process, despite some of the lines of questioning. Although yesterday, Chairman Durbin said that he thinks that some members are crossing the line a little bit by kind of wading into this territory of asking about kind of these random issues, I guess, in their view. But as you heard Senator Cruz say there, he thinks the issue is divisive, and if she has those views, he kind of wanted to flesh them out. But that being said, whether or not she gets Republican support ultimately doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, certainly Democrats would like to have this be a bipartisan vote. So does the White House, considering that she's been confirmed on a bipartisan basis in the past. But the reality is, at the end of the day, they can't confirm her by a simple majority, which would just require Democratic votes. So I do know, after talking to Senator Hawley yesterday, certainly no surprise here, but he did tell me that he's unlikely to support her, that he can't vote for someone with views like that in his view. Senator Cruz wouldn't necessarily say when I asked him if he'll support her. But again, at this point, whether or not they do doesn't necessarily affect the calculus of whether or not she will ultimately be confirmed.
Yeah, well, it was a long day yesterday. Day into the night. It's going to be another long one for her. I know you'll be there, Nicole. Thank you very much.
Great.
Well, Ukrainian forces are pushing back against Russian troops. So coming up after the break, we're going to hear from Holly Williams, who's there on the ground, and Ed O'Keefe, who's in Brussels ahead of President Biden's NATO meeting. And coming up later on Red and Blue, Republicans are ramping up their fight to retake the House during the November midterms. We're going to dive into those efforts with our CBS News political panel. You can stream that conversation in our 6 p.m. Eastern hour.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Some Republicans are now accusing companies like Twitter and Facebook of targeting conservatives.
They've had unchecked power to censor.
I do not have access to my main Facebook account.
I wasn't given an explanation. I was just like, what did I do?
It's not okay to shut down my voice simply because it's not the same as yours.
How those rules are enforced is something that the rest of us know very, very little about.
The First Amendment protects all of us from the government limiting our speech. The companies have the ability to decide what speech they will allow. They're not the government.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. original CBS Reports documentary.
Oh my God, the truck is sinking.
Devastating flooding has reached catastrophic levels.
Rising sea levels are threatening America's coasts.
You would have to take that house and put it on stilts 10 feet tall. If the street is filled with salt water, what difference does it make how high you make your house?
The highest rental rates is exactly where the elevation is highest.
This was the evidence to prove that carbon gentrification was real.
Pay $1,800 in 5 days or you have to leave. Were you scared?
Yes.
Every single person who stood up and said, I am not paying this rent increase, received an eviction.
Haitians built this place and you're getting kicked out.
Yes.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yes. We found it.
You're kidding me?
We got it.
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
The COVID economic shutdown hit Las Vegas harder than any other major city in the nation.
It's decimated the entertainment community.
Even though it looks fairly busy, this is really just a fraction of what business was like prior to COVID.
Last week, there was another large hotel chain that 18,000 were let go.
I haven't seen any jobs that are even close to what I was making.
We're trying to keep things as normal for our kids. I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son.
And I see every day people losing their homes, having to leave Las Vegas.
If I have to start over somewhere else, I have to start over.
An original CBS Reports documentary streaming now.
Welcome back to CBS News Mornings. The time now is 7:31. Let's get you caught up on some of the news that you may have missed. The Supreme Court nomination hearing for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson resumes this morning. Yesterday, she answered Senate questions for nearly 12 hours on topics like critical race theory and judicial philosophy. At least one person is confirmed dead after a tornado touched down near New Orleans, leaving thousands without power this morning. And there are new signs of progress this morning in Ukraine's fight against Russia. Ukrainian ground forces are on the counteroffensive as Russia struggles to supply its troops with fuel and food. And President Biden travels to Europe this morning to meet with NATO and G7 allies amid the war in Ukraine. So for more on this, we want to bring in Ed O'Keefe. Ed's already in Brussels ahead of the president's visit, waiting for him to arrive. So Ed, let's get into this. There are a number of summits taking place. He's going to be meeting with a variety of people. What will the president be doing exactly? And is this going to be, a show of support and a show of unity is great, but I think we need a little more than a show.
Yeah, well, good to see you, Anne-Marie, from the Center of European Diplomacy, where they're putting together 3 hastily arranged summits, all to be held tomorrow. The first is what NATO is calling an extraordinary summit, and it is extraordinary in the essence that normally these meetings take about a month or a year to prepare for, and this one, officially at least, has just come together in the last week or so. So he'll hold that meeting first at NATO headquarters. He's also meeting with members of the G7 to discuss the economic aspects of the ongoing response, the sanctions, and other elements that need to be coordinated. And then he'll also meet with the European Commission, part of the European Union, which already was scheduled to have meetings this week here in Brussels. That gives him a chance to address European leaders from across the continent as this crisis intensifies. Remember, you've heard the president say, you heard the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say yesterday that this crisis is expected to continue for a while, likely to get more violent and worse before it is resolved. And so by bringing the NATO leaders together, there can be more intimate, more direct talk without the virtual pausing and whatnot that happens in these video conferences about military deployments, about what else may be done to help Ukrainians inside their country, and then help Ukrainians, of course, who have dispersed across this continent and around the world since the crisis began.
You mentioned sanctions. Of course, sanctions work much better when multiple nations are all on the same page. We're going to be hearing more about sanctions against Russia?
That's right. The White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan again yesterday saying that there will be talk during the meetings tomorrow about new sanctions against Russia, but also bolstering the enforcement mechanisms or putting some teeth on the sanctions that have already been announced to ensure that those that are being targeted around the world can't continue to evade the punishments. That signals that there's probably going to be a little more detail shared about how the United States, for example, is working with other European countries to go after oligarchs with ties to Vladimir Putin. How are they seizing their assets? How are they tracking down the yachts, for example, the real estate they may own here in Europe and across the world, or their other money wherever it may be hidden? Remember, we believe on paper, the estimates are that Vladimir Putin is in essence worth more than $125 billion, but that wealth is spread out across associates in the Russian government, oligarchs who live in Russia, outside of Russia. Even some of his relatives and current and former lovers are in possession of some of this wealth. And so we're likely going to hear a little more about the ongoing coordination to get that done.
There's reports that Ukrainian President Zelensky may address the meetings virtually. Ukraine has been pushing for EU and NATO membership, but said yesterday that it will renounce membership in return for a Russian ceasefire, if, of course, they want to sit down and actually talk about peace. Does that complicate things a little bit?
It could. It certainly could, because while these two major European alliances, the EU and NATO, have said no to Ukraine, or not yet, in recent years, that's partly due to domestic political problems that the country was having in terms of its elections and other corruption concerns that weren't up to snuff with other EU members. But now, of course, to have them renounce membership in either alliance as part of a negotiated settlement to this crisis could be seen as another win for Vladimir Putin. So I'm sure there'll be some conversation about whether or not Zelensky should do that, with an acknowledgement that ultimately it is up to him to figure out a way, to be involved in figuring out a way to end this crisis. But Zelensky's latest virtual address to any one of these meetings will come amid his extraordinary virtual world tour, where he's been addressing world congresses or parliaments, whether it's the Americans last week, the Canadians, the Brits, the Spanish, and yesterday in a conversation with the Pope, urging him to become more engaged in this, to renounce what Vladimir Putin is doing, and to more actively engage on the issue. No other world leader right now has that kind of political capital and global support, at least in the Western world, or in the democratic, lowercase d democratic world, to go around the world lecturing his counterparts and saying, you've got to do more to help me. But given the crisis, given the intrigue around Zelensky, they want to hear from him. They will benefit from hearing from him. The world certainly is still intrigued by what he has to say. He knows that, and so he'll continue to apply pressure.
Yeah, and you're right about lecturing, because he really doesn't pull any punches during these virtual meetings. Ed, thank you very much. Yeah. Well, there are new signs of progress this morning in Ukraine's fight against Russia. That's some good news. Holly Williams is about 100 miles west of Kyiv, where many people are coming together to fight back and defend their country.
This video appears to show a column of Russian military vehicles being lured into a trap in the town of Voznesensk earlier this month. Helping with the ambush was a shopkeeper, Alexander. You little beauties, he shouts. Nearly a month after Russia invaded its neighbour, its ground forces have made surprisingly slow progress. Ukraine's military says it recaptured the town of Makariv on Monday, a key strategic gateway to the capital, Kyiv. And across Ukraine, ordinary people have mobilised to defend their homeland. At this checkpoint, we met Anatoly, a pig farmer.
Okay, loaded.
Armed with his own hunting rifle. He told us the biggest thing he ever shot before was a goat, but now he's ready to fight the Russians, with an improvised bomb shelter dug out by the roadside.
This is the protection from missiles and airstrikes.
They've got tyre spikes and other obstacles to stop a Russian advance.
These are to throw in the way of the tanks and disable them.
I'll show you.
And Vitaly, a greengrocer, showed us their homemade arsenal of Molotov cocktails.
Would you be willing to give up some of Ukraine's territory for peace?
It's impossible to give our territory away, he told us. I won't agree to anything else. Ukraine's fighting spirit is breathtaking. The ingenuity and bravery of its people extraordinary. But from the air, Russia is leaving carnage in its path. This hospital was decimated by a Russian missile strike on Monday, say Ukrainian officials, killing 3.
Well, the search for an 18-year-old woman in Nevada has intensified after authorities say that she disappeared while she was waiting for a ride to work. We're going to have more on the investigation and why police believe she was kidnapped. That's coming up next.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Some Republicans are now accusing companies like Twitter and Facebook of targeting conservatives.
They've had unchecked power to censor.
I do not have access to my main Facebook account.
I wasn't given an explanation. I was just like, what did I do?
It's not okay to shut down my voice simply because it's not the same as yours.
How those rules are enforced is something that the rest of us know very, very little about.
The First Amendment protects all of us from the government limiting our speech. The companies have the ability to decide what speech they will allow. They're not the government.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
Oh my God, the truck is sinking.
Devastating flooding has reached catastrophic levels.
Rising sea levels are threatening America's coasts.
You would have to take that house and put it on stilts 10 feet tall. If the street is filled with salt water, what difference does it make how high you make your house?
The highest rental rates is exactly where the elevation is highest.
This was the evidence to prove that climate gentrification was real.
Pay $1,800 in 5 days or you have to leave. Were you scared?
Yes.
Every single person who stood up and said, I am not paying this rent increase, received an eviction.
Haitians built this place and you're getting kicked out.
Yes.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yes. We found it.
You're kidding me?
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
The COVID economic shutdown hit Las Vegas harder than any other major city in the nation.
It's decimated the entertainment community.
Even though it looks fairly busy, this is really just a fraction of what business was like prior to COVID.
Last week, there was another large hotel chain that 18,000 were let go.
I haven't seen any jobs that are even close to what I was making.
We're trying to keep things as normal for our kids. I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son.
And I see every day people losing their homes, having to leave Las Vegas.
If I have to start over somewhere else, I have to start over.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
Breaking news as it happens. CBS News New York on the CBS News app and Pluto TV.
A shift to remote work during the COVID-19 pandemic emptied out offices across the U.S., but companies are now bringing their workers back. However, the real estate market for offices is in a whole different place than it was before the pandemic. So to break this down, we want to bring in Corey Schouten. He's the editor-in-chief of Crain's New York Business, and he joins me now. Thanks for joining us. So let's start with just like what happened to the commercial office retail space during the pandemic? Because I presume some companies had leases they couldn't break. Others, maybe their leases came up and they thought, do I need all this space?
Absolutely, absolutely. It was a tough period for all sectors of real estate. Of course, the others bounced back. We've got residential has come back. Distribution has bounced back. People are still ordering things online. But the category of office has really been a struggle. And so tenants have the upper hand still there as leasing rates have remained relatively high because a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of companies couldn't get out of existing leases, but occupancy is still really low.
So then what does it mean if tenants have the upper hand? What does it mean in terms of, I don't know, re-upping your lease or whatever?
It means that they can negotiate a little more. They have a little more of a leg to stand on with the landlords that they didn't have before. They can ask for more flexible terms. They can ask for upgrades to their office space. They can ask for, in many cases, a little bit lower rent. One thing I would caveat, which is always true of real estate, pandemic or not, is location, location, location. It's very specific to where the offices are located. Some areas are actually thriving. Others are pretty grim.
Well, I am seeing what's happening in our own office space and how, we're going back to hybrid, which means that people come in some days out of the week, but not all of the week. And so they're figuring out creative ways to use the space. Are you seeing that across the board with businesses?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think that we can also look to malls, shopping malls. Remember those giant shopping malls?
Yeah, they've struggled to get people in.
They've struggled. And the anchor stores are not the draw that they were anymore. And there was a captive audience for shopping malls.
Right.
Shoppers had nowhere else to go, right? We figured out that now that we have other options, we don't have to lug everyone into a car. We don't have to find a parking spot, carry our stuff out. And then if we can find the parking spot when we leave the mall. So that captive audience disappeared. We found a better way. So I suspect if we look toward office space, those owners are going to have to look at the users and find out the best things that the users are looking for. How do we provide more amenities? How is it more convenience? How is it closer to your home, potentially? And also, how do you collaborate better with your colleagues?
I think that is fascinating. You know, when you made me think about malls, and really the last few times I've gone to a mall, it was for an attraction, not to shop. But it got me there. And then, of course, you start looking around. So maybe there are ways to make it more attractive to come into the office.
Very true.
Corey, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
This Money Watch segment has been brought to you by Principal, helping you plan, protect, invest, and retire.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Some Republicans are now accusing companies like Twitter and Facebook of targeting conservatives.
They've had unchecked power to censor.
I do not have access to my main Facebook account.
I wasn't given an explanation. I was just like, what did I do?
It's not okay to shut down my voice simply because it's not the same as yours.
How those rules are enforced is something that the rest of us know very, very little about.
And the First Amendment protects all of us from the government limiting our speech. The companies have the ability to decide what speech they will allow. They're not the government.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now. An original CBS Reports documentary.
Oh my God, the truck is sinking.
Devastating flooding has reached catastrophic levels.
Rising sea levels are threatening America's coasts.
You would have to take that house and put it on stilts 10 feet tall. If the street is filled with salt water, what difference does it make how high you make your house?
The highest rental rates is exactly where the elevation is highest.
This was the evidence to prove that climate gentrification was real.
Pay $1,800 in 5 days or you have to leave. Were you scared?
Yes.
Every single person who stood up and said, I am not paying this rent increase, received an eviction.
Haitians built this place and you're getting kicked out.
Yes.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yes. We found it.
You're kidding me?
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
The COVID economic shutdown hit Las Vegas harder than any other major city in the nation.
It's decimated the entertainment community.
So even though it looks fairly busy, this is really just a fraction of what business was like prior to COVID.
Last week, there was another large hotel chain that 18,000 were let go.
I haven't seen any jobs that are even close to what I was making.
We're trying to keep things as normal for our kids. I have a 16-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son.
And I see every day people losing their homes, having to leave Las Vegas.
If I have to start over somewhere else, I'll have to start over.
An original CBS Reports documentary, streaming now.
Well, two prominent Democrats have tested positive for the coronavirus. Hillary Clinton announced her positive test yesterday, saying that she has mild symptoms and she's doing fine. Former President Bill Clinton has tested negative. Meanwhile, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki has tested positive for the second time. Her first positive test came in October. The president has tested negative. Health officials fear that we could see another spike in cases as new data shows the Omicron subvariant known as BA2 now makes up more than a third of all positive tests overall. Infections are down from January's record highs, though. And a desperate search is underway in Nevada for an 18-year-old woman who disappeared over a week ago. Authorities say Naomi Arion was last seen in her car waiting for a ride to work. Tanya Backus reports.
As the search continues for 18-year-old Naomi Arion, her mother makes a desperate plea.
Please save my daughter and bring her home.
Investigators in Lyon County, Nevada say Arion was last seen on the morning of March 12th. She was waiting inside her car in a Walmart parking lot in Fernley for a shuttle to take her to work when the man seen in this surveillance video walked up, got in with her, and drove away.
At 05:24 hours, the suspect approaches Naomi's vehicle, and at 05:25 hours, Naomi's vehicle leaves the Walmart parking lot with the suspect driving the vehicle.
Police say Naomi was on social media right before she disappeared. Her phone then went dark. Investigators found her car in the area a few days later. They say her disappearance is criminal.
We're working around the clock. Our agency, the FBI, this has gone statewide, nationwide.
Over the weekend, hundreds of people searched for Arion on foot, on horses, and ATVs.
When I heard that it happened in our little community and it was my friend's family member, it hurt. It struck home.
Her family is holding on to hope.
This is life or death for a beautiful and fun and amazing sister, daughter, and friend. She was just starting. She is. She's just starting her adult life.
Investigators also believe this dark-colored four-door pickup truck may be related to her disappearance and are asking anyone with information to contact them. Tanya Backus, CBS News.
Well, we have been following the news of tornadoes ripping through the South, so let's bring in meteorologist Jim Cantori from the Weather Channel's global headquarters in Atlanta. Jim, it was a busy day yesterday weather-wise, and it looks like it's shaping up to be something very similar today as well for some parts of the country.
Yeah, so Anne-Marie, we're 4 days into spring. 3 days have had tornadoes and or tornado warnings. If all of the tornado reports come to fruition, we will have had half a month's worth of tornadoes in 2 days, and we are not done. You can see where those reports have been. So far, 18 confirmed tornadoes in Texas. Yesterday, another 26 in Mississippi. And, of course, the big one that moved through the New Orleans metro area towards sunset last night. So let's talk about that a little bit. We expected the atmosphere to perform yesterday. And what we mean by that is, could we have long-track tornadoes that would stay on the ground for a while? This may have been one of them. Unfortunately, right in a very populated area, the 9th Ward, Arabi area is very, very hard hit with what surely looks like a higher-end tornado and the damage. You can see that track from Jean Lafitte all the way up to Slidell. That's the same supercell. It's not always the same strength because it cycles at times, but we can actually see when it's potentially producing a tornado in what we call the storm relative velocity. And this is going to reset for us. Look at that, from Jean Lafitte all the way up here southeast of the city center of New Orleans, that red-green area together, that's the rotation, that's the spin. Those are the kind of things that we look for, certainly, when we see tornadoes that are on the ground. Today, everything shifts off to the east, some different parameters, but a lot of real estate, still with the potential for hail, a few isolated tornadoes, Michigan, Ohio, hail and damaging winds and tornadoes from the Florida Panhandle all the way up into Virginia and eastern North Carolina. So we still got another day of this with our Torcon numbers at 3, which is a 3 out of a 10 chance. So not as high as the last 2 days, which have been 7. So let's take a look at the radar. Already active this morning across the Florida Panhandle. We're expecting storms to grow upscale through North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina as we go on through the day and the evening, and even up into Ohio and Michigan. You think, wow, that far to the north? Absolutely. Some of the same dynamics that can produce the tornadoes in the south are actually present today in Ohio and into southern Michigan. So that's going to be another area to watch for us. This should move offshore as we get into tonight. A small risk, certainly during the overnight hours, but certainly not the one that we've had over the past couple of days. Some very heavy rain, too, for the Florida Panhandle and possibly into northern Florida as well. So as I mentioned, on average, 97 tornadoes for the month of March. If all the storm reports for tornadoes come through just for the last couple of days, we will have had over half those. Wow. If this is a sign of what we're going to be dealing with this spring, watch out, everybody. Anne-Marie, you can catch live coverage of the severe threat all day on the Weather Channel television network.
All right, Jim, thank you very much. You can also get the latest on the storms on our CBS News app. The app gives you access to all of our CBS News national and local streams for free, anytime, anywhere. So the time now is 7:55. Here's a look at what's coming up today. In about an hour, Supreme Court nominee Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson will face another round of intense questioning during her confirmation hearings. Senators will resume asking her about major issues, high-profile legal cases, and her own record. In about an hour, President Biden is expected to leave for Brussels, where he will meet with NATO allies and discuss the ongoing response to Russia's war in Ukraine. He's then going to travel to Poland, where thousands of U.S. troops are stationed. Supply chain issues will be the main focus of a hearing on Capitol Hill today. Several CEOs are set to testify before the Senate Commerce Committee this morning, and they're going to advocate for legislation they argue is key to boosting American competitiveness. And coming up in our 9 o'clock hour, the lead singer of the Ukrainian group Kaska is going to be joining us on the set to discuss the war and how she was forced to escape her home country. You can stream that at around 9:30 Eastern. So if you are heading out the door, take us with you. You can access all of our CBS News national and local streams for free anytime, anywhere on the CBS News app. CBS Mornings is next. I will see you in about an hour. But first, we're going to leave you with some late night laughs.
You know this is to avoid noise disruptions during the confirmation hearings. This is true. The Senate had to temporarily suspend the use of free weights in the gym, which is directly above the hearing room. The most surprising revelation about all of this is that the Senate gym isn't just two recumbent bikes from the 80s and a single shake weight.
An original CBS Reports documentary.
Some Republicans are now accusing companies like Twitter and Facebook of targeting conservatives.
They've had unchecked power to censor.
I do not have access to my main Facebook account.
I wasn't given an explanation. I was just like, what did I do?